Well, hello and welcome to this presentation on vulnerability to ethical failure. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Hart, and this presentation is for the Initial Command and Staff College Land Reserves course. And at the end of this 45-minute presentation, what I hope the end state's going to be is that we're all going to understand why we should behave ethically in war, why this is difficult to do, and importantly, what we as leaders can do to help mitigate against these risks. And in going through this, I'm going to talk about behaviour being driven by three separate factors. I'm going to talk about behaviour being driven by the situation of war itself, war as a driver of the systems and groups that we're part of, and the individual agency we each have, the decisions we make. And importantly, as I go through this, and as I talk about the system power and the situational power, I'm not removing any individual agency. We must all remember that we have the power to make our own decisions. And whilst the situation of war and the systems and groups we're part of makes exercising that individual agency at times very challenging, we all still retain that agency. But first of all, I just want to address the challenge of what is ethical behaviour in war. Because it's not easy to define, it's not easy to describe. It clearly can't be not killing. Killing is inherent to the activities of war. Is it not murdering? Well, murdering by whose definition? Under whose laws not murdering? Not committing atrocities presents the same challenge. Who describes what an atrocity is or what isn't an atrocity? The nuclear weapons attack at Nagasaki and Hiroshima would be an atrocity by many people's definitions, but not by others. Winning. Ultimately, winning may well be the methodology of describing what is and what is not ethical behaviour in war. The purpose of war and the purpose of us as part of it is to fight and win. And we'll come to discuss how that might conflict with ethical behaviour in war in a few moments. Because fundamentally there's the law. There's a huge tract of law that's based mainly in the just war traditions that describes what is not and is allowable in the field of war. The Hague Conventions, national law, parliamentary law, the Geneva Conventions, the United Nations, and indeed the European Convention on Human Rights, and how they apply during war. So we don't actually need to discuss this in too much detail, surely. The idea is that actually the law is there and the law helps, but the law is not complete. The law tells us what we can do. It doesn't tell us what we should do. For that, we need a slightly deeper understanding of what is right and wrong. And for this, I'll offer two separate ideas, two hypotheses, if you will, a hypothesis and an antithesis. The antithesis will be a utilitarian ideal, the greatest good for the greatest number. But my hypothesis is a deontological idea, an idea that there are just some things we do not do. So starting off with consequentialism and utilitarianism, and this can be easily explained, perhaps using the analogy that we'll all be familiar with, Crimson Tide. And you'll remember, I'm sure, that part of this movie is where Denzel Washington's submarine gets hit by a torpedo and there's a compartment that starts to be flooded. But there's two sailors still in that compartment. But Denzel Washington orders that the door gets closed, that those two sailors die in order to save everyone else on board ship. So he kills two people, but in doing so, saves many more. And that's the idea at the heart of utilitarianism. The idea that what you're doing is the greatest good for the greatest number. And you will do things that, from the perception of some individuals, will be wrong, but actually will deliver the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest amount of human happiness. And if you extend this idea to war, the whole idea of war is in itself atrocious. The idea that you're going to use violence, use force to assert your will on an opponent. Curtis LeMay, who was an American Air Force general during World War II and later, was a fierce advocate of going hard in war, of not restraining the use of force. He was in many ways the architect of the firebombing of Japan and ultimately of the use of the nuclear weapons on that country. And he was fond of telling the anecdote that a stupid man once advocated that you should cut off a dog's tail 1 inch at a time so it didn't hurt as much. His argument is that the most ethical thing to do in war is to make it finish as quickly as possible. War is atrocious. We don't want to have war. Therefore, the purpose of soldiers is to make sure that war finishes as quickly as we can make it finish. And to do that, we may need to do atrocious things. But by reducing the length of war, actually what we're doing is increasing the benefit to all. And Cicero in Antiquity, he says, in war, the law is silent. Now, clearly that's not true in the contemporary environment, factually, but figuratively we can understand what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that the law is different. It's not the same. That we do things in war that are atrocious, but that's war. We just get on with it. The purpose is to fight and win. But that's not a complete understanding of what forms right and wrong. And the other argument that we can put is that there is a red line between what we should do and what we can do. And the famous proponent of the utilitarian ideals, Jack Bauer from the 24 movies, very fond of torturing a few people in order to get the information he needs to get the bomb from the building. Jack Bauer, the ultimate utilitarian, he does these morally indefensible things in order to seek the greatest good for the greatest number. But on the other side of that red line is the Boy Scout. The Boy Scout knows there are rules. He doesn't break those rules. There are things he just doesn't do. And deontologicalism in war would give you war within limits. Now, it's not a perfect model. It's not a perfect understanding of what right and wrong is. Imagine, for example, a medic who gives treatment in the field. On one day you go on a patrol and you see an injured child and you give aid to that injured child. Of course you would. It's one of the things you do. You always give aid to injured people. It's one of those red lines. The child goes back to their village and the next day the Taliban comes to the village and they execute 10 elders from the village for having help from British forces. The patrol goes out the next day and they find another injured child. But it's one of your red lines. You always help injured people. So surely you help that injured child again today. Or do you accept the fact that actually by helping that injured child, you're going to cause the death of others? So deontologicalism doesn't provide you the perfect answer. So fundamentally, we have this problem of utilitarianism versus deontologism that doesn't give us a pure idea of what right and wrong in war is. It is more complex than that. But my hypothesis, what I'm suggesting to you is that in order to seek victory, there must be a line between right and wrong. At the strategic level, we may understand that we go to war to protect our own values. And to win war, we must break those values. Well, that must mean that at the end state, actually our values haven't been protected. So to achieve strategic victory in war, we must have a restraint on our behaviour. Our behaviour must be coherent with our values. At the operational level, the manoeuvrist approach, about which you all on this course will hear a great deal more when you come back for the 2-week main course. The manoeuvrist approach requires us to shatter the enemy's will and cohesion. But by committing murderous atrocity, actually all we do is reinforce the enemy's will and cohesion. There's much evidence to show that in Germany, the carpet bombing, the firebombing of their cities actually drew the population together. It reinforced their will to fight. And at the tactical level, if the enemy believe that if when they're taken as POWs they're going to be executed or maltreated, they're going to fight to the death. It's going to make tactical victory that much harder to achieve. So there must be a restraint on our behaviour, and we must seek to avoid murderous atrocity if we are to achieve victory at an organisational level. But at an individual level, we've got to restrain our behaviour as well. And I'd offer 2 fundamental reasons. In reverse order from the slide there, first will be the penalty of law. Ultimately, none of us wish to be gripping the bar at the Old Bailey or at The Hague, accused of murderous atrocity. there is a penalty in law for such behaviour. But there is also moral injury. We have to live with our actions. What we do in war will follow us. And the idea that we will have to live with the guilt if we behave in an atrocious way causes us some form of long-term injury. So my hypothesis to you is that we must behave ethically in war, and we must understand the forces that drive us to behave unethically, and we must armour against those. And I spoke earlier about the contemporary context of this. Well, here's a short video where General Sir Peter Wall will describe some of the contemporary context.
I'd like to thank Sir William Gage for his thorough and challenging inquiry into the appalling circumstances surrounding the death of Mr. Baha Musa in British Army hands in Basra in September 2003, and for his comprehensive recommendations. As its professional head, I will take the lead in implementing the specific recommendations relating to the Army as soon as possible, in accordance with the direction of the Secretary of State for Defence. What happened to Baha Musa and his fellow detainees in 2003 was, in the words of the inquiry, grave and shameful. The Army has apologised unreservedly to Baha Musa's family and to the surviving victims of this shocking episode. And I would like to take this opportunity to repeat that apology today, in particular to Colonel Musa, Baha Musa's father, and to his family. We demand a great deal of our soldiers who daily face threats on operations to protect Britain's safety and security. The vast majority of them demonstrate high standards of professionalism and behaviour in all that they do. This is the essence of the Army's reputation, at home and abroad. The shameful circumstances of Baha Musa's death have cast a dark shadow on that reputation. This must not happen again.
Grave and shameful. This must not happen again. Let's just think of the context of what happened there. A man who was perfectly healthy was arrested by British forces, and less than 48 hours later, he had been kicked to death. Kicked to death. So let's try and understand the kind of forces that are at play. And earlier I offered a model of the situation of war, the systems and groups, and the individual. And we'll just drill into each one of those a little bit now and discuss how they could act in order to change behaviour in such a fundamental way. So first of all, looking at the situation of war and understanding situational morality. I'm sure many of you will recognise that picture. That's from the Stanford prison experiments conducted by Philip Zimbardo, where they took a collection of psychology undergraduates, all psychology experiments done on psychology undergraduates, one of the most experimented on groups of people in the world. And these undergraduates were put into a mock prison. Half were randomly assigned as guards and half randomly assigned as prisoners. And then their behaviour was monitored and watched. And the experiment had to be abandoned after 5 days because the behaviour of the guards had become so extreme that it was damaging the health of the prisoners. And the conclusion from this experiment Professor Zimbardo drew is that the situation we're put in drives our behaviour. It says the situation, and an atrocious situation will describe atrocious behaviour. The Stanford prison experiment was then repeated again in 2001. It was repeated at a place called Abu Ghraib. This time it wasn't stopped after 5 days. The experiment continued. And Professor Zimbardo was a witness for the defence at the prosecution of some of the detainees from the Abu Ghraib case. And his argument was that the prison guards actually behaved entirely predictably. Their behaviour was precisely normal. It was the situation that had been constructed around them that elicited the behavioural response. It wasn't that they were, in and of themselves, evil and atrocious people. But the conclusion is that we are vulnerable to the situation we're in. Our behaviour is not only driven by our character and our personality, but is driven by the situation. And different situations will have different ethics and different morals. So what is the situation of war? And how might this change our behaviour? Well, the situation of war is one where there is opportunity without consequence. There isn't the same legal framework, there isn't the same construct of social restraint in war that there is in peacetime. There isn't a police force that goes around and arresting behaviours. There isn't the social restraint on the way that you behave that you see in our normal society. There is opportunity without consequence, and there is an ineffective judicial system. There isn't that police force wandering around. And in such a construct, your behaviour changes. Violence is the common currency of war, and violence is normalised. In normal societal behaviour, you don't see violence being used as the go-to solution, but in war you do. For example, in Somalia, Canadian peacekeepers in the early 1990s were subject to a great deal of petty thievery. Their solution was not to build a bigger fence or have better lighting. It was to set an ambush, an armed ambush, to try and catch the thieves. You see that violence is used as a common currency. It's used as a way of solving problems that outside of war, violence wouldn't be used to solve. You have heightened emotional arousal of all the participants of war. Frustration, fear, love for your fellow soldiers, for your brothers in arms, rage, revenge. And in these heightened emotional arousal situations, you make morally poor decisions. You're more vulnerable to ethical failure. Finally, fundamental to war is this idea of dehumanisation, where you otherise the enemy. And this is enhanced even more across racial boundaries. In World War II, you see a much greater expression of violence where the combatants cross a racial seam. So in Western Europe, where broadly speaking the combatants are of West European descent, you see a much lower incident of atrocity than you do where on the Eastern Front, between the Russians and the Germans, and indeed in the Far East between the Japanese and the Americans. Many Americans under training express the desire to kill a Jap. You don't see them expressing the same desire to kill a Hun, to kill a German. So this idea that racism fuels otherization. And you look at the enemy and you see an other, a different person. And to that different person you apply a different moral standard. And if that other person is inhuman, then the moral standard you apply to them is even lower. So you dehumanize the enemy, and in so doing, you enable and allow atrocious conduct to flourish. So the situation of war in and of itself warps our sense of what is right and wrong. And we're vulnerable to that situation. We're vulnerable to change our behaviour in different situations, and the situation of war is atrocious. Looking at the next driving behaviour, we don't go to war in isolation as individuals. We go as part of systems and groups. And in the same way that we're vulnerable to pressures on the situation, we're vulnerable to pressures from the group. And Solomon Osh conducted an experiment to show this, and you may well have seen this. There's 3 lines there, A, B and C in Exhibit 2. And the question would come, Exhibit 1, which of the lines A, B and C is the same length? And there's a series of cards that have similar questions on them. And you have a group of people sat in front of you conducting the experiment. Again, psychology undergraduates, unsurprisingly. And you ask, put your hands up. And you go around the room and you ask. And people who might initially dissent, because all the people in the room are stooges, apart from the one subject who's being experimented on. And 66% of people will adjust their behaviour. And by the end of the 15 cards, will have shown some conformity to the group norm. They won't continue to dissent. So Solomon-Asch proves we adjust our behaviour to adopt to group norms. And this instance is even more stark in high-performance teams, in which we may include our unit or elements of the military. This idea of the high-performance team as a primary group, a group that replaces in many ways your own family construct. It becomes us and them. You wouldn't understand, because only we understand. Only the people inside the team really understand the situation, really understand what's required. And the team is completely goal-focused. And they're goal-focused with the team over the individual. So we're about achieving the mission, about achieving the task. And we'll do that at the expense of the team, at the expense of the individual. It's about the task. And that task-focused behaviour can become atrocious in its own sense. There can often be selective entry in initiation. And that selective entry often requires applicants to subordinate their morals to group morals. Think of rugby club initiations. Think of fraternity hazings. Think of extreme military selection processes, where behaviour you wouldn't have done before, in order to gain entry, in order to be part of that high-performance team, you'll change your behaviour and change your conduct. And you'll demonstrate that your morals are less important than the behaviours being expressed by the group. Imagine going on some absurd university rugby club drinking night, where the night may culminate in drinking your own urine or something stupid like that. Something you'd never normally do. But in order to show your desire to join the group and the fact that what people in the group tell you to do, you'll do, you subordinate yourself to that kind of behaviour. And there's normalised ethical deviance. Everyone's doing something wrong, therefore it's not wrong. We're all doing it, we understand, we're doing something wrong. Normalised ethical deviance. You wouldn't understand. And if ever you feel yourself saying that, speaking to someone outside your group and saying you wouldn't understand you're being subject to this normalised ethical deviance inside the team. And you see it time and time again. Lance Armstrong's US postal team, the Ferrari Formula One team stealing secrets from McLaren, the banking crisis, the bankers, the Libor scandal, high-performance teams change their ethical behaviour, not accepting that what they're doing is wrong. And what can we say about the military group? There may well be a say-do gap between what the military says and what it does. We would say we're diverse, equal opportunity, nurturing, we're caring and we save lives, we're heroic and we punish transgressions. But if we interrogate those claims, we might suggest that actually we're homogenous. We're not a particularly diverse organisation. We might say that within the military there is actually significant evidence of sexist, racist and homophobic behaviours. And the organisation's trying to stamp it out, but it's trying to stamp it out because it does exist. And that whilst we would say we're nurturing, actually bullying and hypermasculine behaviours are prevalent in the military. The idea the military is a caring organisation, but ultimately we're about fighting and winning. We're about winning wars. And part of that is taking lives. So violence is an accepted part of military behaviour. And if you think about the behaviours that are most heroised inside the army, they are violent ones. And that comes back to heroic, but heroism is usually defined by the in-group. And heroes, by and large, are defined by the behaviour they have taken to save and protect members of the in-group, other members of the military, as opposed to heroism as described, protecting civilians or protecting people outside the group. And whilst we say we punish transgressions, is the truth in reality that we protect our own. The green wall of silence, as Sir William Gage referred to the evidence given at the Baha Musa inquiry, when members of the unit that had been responsible for the death of Baha Musa came to court. None of them could remember anything that had happened. The green wall of silence. So we say we punish our transgressions, but actually perhaps we protect our own. That's a photograph there of the doctor from the Baha Musa unit. That doctor was held accountable by the British Medical Council and was struck off. Actually, inside the unit, he was the only man who was held professionally accountable. We held individuals legally accountable. 7 people were taken to court, 1 person convicted. But broader than the criminal accountability, only the doctor was held professionally accountable, and he wasn't held accountable by the military, he was held accountable by the General Medical Council. So, despite the claims that we're actually hunting out bad apples, we could perhaps say that it's not only a bad barrel, it's bad barrel makers that are resulting in atrocious behaviours. The final area of drivers to behaviour I'm going to look at is the individual. And going back to the point I made right at the beginning that we all have agency here. We are all able to make our own decisions. The idea that the people that commit these atrocities are psychopaths, actually they're different from us. They must in some way be different because we couldn't do that. And I think sitting where you're sitting now, I would hope you have the sense that you couldn't commit such atrocious behaviours. I'm sure many of you will know the photograph on the right, that of William Rusty Calley, slightly below average intelligence man, who was then responsible in the village of My Lai in Vietnam for the murder of over 500 men, women, children and old men. I say the age range deliberately because it was a village where the majority of draft age males were absent, and it was women, babies and old people who were mainly murdered in My Lai that day. You think Calley's got to be some kind of psychopath. There's got to be something wrong. There's a man who lined people up in a drainage ditch and executed them. I mean, it's like Holocaust type behaviour. Surely this man's got to be some kind of psychopath. But of course the reality is he isn't. He was slightly below average intelligence, but he was actually just a particularly average soldier. And all his competency reports suggest that. His men didn't particularly like him, he wasn't a particularly great officer, but he was certainly not noticeably different from many, many other officers operating in the same environment at the same time. But he was a leader. He was the platoon commander on that day. And that leads us to an interesting observation about the power of authority, the power of the leader. And you'll recognise that photograph, I'm sure, from the Stanley Milgram electric shock experiments, when there is an authority figure wearing a lab coat and holding a clipboard, an experimental subject who believes he has been randomly assigned the job of being an educator, and another experimental subject is randomly assigned the job of being a learner. Of course, it's a fix. Actually, all the experimental subjects are educators, and the guy getting electric shock's a stooge who's acting. He's not actually getting an electric shock. And every time the learner gets a question wrong, the educator's job is to give him an electric shock. And that electric shock increases in intensity every time he gets a wrong answer. And at one stage, the electric shock goes beyond a level where it's marked dangerous, risk of death. And at the beginning of the experiment, they asked, well, how many people will go beyond that level? So, well, only a very small number, 1% of people. The psychopaths will go beyond that level, but the rest of us won't go beyond that level. And they run the experiment. Over 2/3 of people give lethal electric shocks just because a man in a white coat and a clipboard says, no, you must. The experiment requires that you give that man an electric shock for getting a wrong answer. And they ran many different variations of the experiment. And under the standard conditions, 2/3 of people give an electric shock. But actually, if you diffuse the responsibility, if a peer gives the electric shock, so the person who's the educator tells someone else to press the button, it goes up to 97%. Diffusion of responsibility. But if there's other dissenters in the room, if someone else in the room is taking the role of an educator and that person says, I'm not doing it, then compliance falls down to 13%. So we can see how group behaviour, diffusion of responsibility increases atrocious behaviour, and having some kind of dissent in the room decreases it. Fundamentally, the power of the leader, the power of the man in the white coat and the clipboard Well, that leader's in the same situation as everyone else. He is part of a group. He is as vulnerable to atrocious behaviour as the individuals he's commanding. The idea that we as officers are perhaps in some way morally superior, able to exercise ethical superpowers to raise ourselves out of the situation is fallacious. It's not true. What you need is someone who is remote from the situation. Another study was this. Maybe you know this kindly looking, sad-faced old gentleman. If you don't know him, you maybe recognise his ID card photo a little bit more. This is Adolf Eichmann. This is the architect of the Holocaust. Not the architect, the builder. After someone else had the atrocious idea of massacring the entire Jewish nation, entire Jewish race in Europe, someone had to make that idea into movement tables and plans and trains and locations of death camps and how you would move people and what rate at which people would arrive. So the rate at which people arrived was the same as the rate at which people could be killed and could be put into work. And someone had to do all that maths. And that bloke was Adolf Eichmann. And you think that guy's got to be a monster. And then he was picked up by the Mossad in South America in the 1950s, and he's not a monster. He's not a psychopath. He's just a bloke who thought he was doing his job and was doing it well. And when he was interviewed by a political scientist called Hannah Arendt, she came up with the phrase, the banality of evil. The banality. Actually, it was just normal. It was just the behaviour. It's just what he was doing. It's just the way we do things around here. You wouldn't understand. Evil in that situation, in that group, had just become banal. Another face from My Lai. This is the man who perhaps we should be remembering from My Lai. This is Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson. He was a helicopter pilot on that day. And what Hugh Thompson shows is the power of the remote leader, the power of the individual who's not immersed in the situation. He was flying his helicopter above My Lai, and he could see the piles of bodies inside the village. And he could see what the American soldiers were doing. And he landed his helicopter inside the village. He got out, got into a drainage ditch, and he rescued a young child and took him to hospital. And as he was doing that, he said to his door gunner, "You point your gun at those American soldiers. If they kill the civilians over there, you shoot them." After the war, Warrant Officer Thompson was subject to congressional hearings where he was accused of war crimes. He was accused of ordering his gunner to shoot at American soldiers illegally. This is a man who flew down to try and stop a massacre from happening. He died a few years ago. It's a great shame. He was giving speeches on ethics all around the world, and I would have loved to hear him speak. He's an incredible person, incredible story to tell. But the lesson it gives us is the idea that someone who's not involved in the situation, who's not immersed in what is going on, who's not part of that group, the power of the remote leader to look at something and say, hey, this is not right, and then do something about it. The power of that man is incredible. So we've had a look at why ethical behaviour in war is important. Why is it that we must behave ethically? Why it's useful for victory. And the forces, the situation, the systems, and the individual agency that actually draw us towards unethical behaviour, that push us towards atrocity. But what can we do about it? Well, I would suggest that for systems and groups, we must lead the right culture. It's too late to try and lead the right culture once you get into contact. We must lead the right culture out of contact. We must understand how racism, homophobia, sexism, how these behaviours, otherisation, is actually the thin end of the wedge. It accepts that we can define different moral standards to people who are different from us. And once we accept that as a principle, it enables atrocious action downstream. We must understand the environment. We can't change the situation of war. If we change the situation of war, the nature of war, it would cease to be war. but we must understand the situation of war, and we must prepare our soldiers for it. And as individuals, we must know our soldiers. We must know their behaviour so we can see when their behaviour is changing. And we must empower remote leaders. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. The idea that those people who are not immersed in the situation are able to come, look at the situation and independently audit behaviours. And if you think the way that in the military actually we lionise the man on the ground, we lionise the FOB commander, someone will come to visit and we will lionise that behaviour rather than perhaps examining it, auditing it and saying there's ethical behaviour here that we're not quite sure of. We must be prepared to empower remote leaders. So I hope now we've got an understanding of the end state. You understand why we should behave ethically in war, why this is so difficult, and perhaps some measure of what leaders can do to mitigate against these risks. But I'll put up this slide. And maybe you look at that and you see the devils. Maybe you look at that and you see the angels. But the reality is there is both in all of us. Both the devil and the angel. Both Warrant Officer Thompson and William Calley. Both individuals who did incredible things, but on very different ends of the spectrum. And we must take care that when we work to eliminate deviant behaviour that leads to atrocity, what we don't do is eliminate the behaviours that lead to heroism. If you're interested in the subjects we've discussed over the last 40 minutes or so, I recommend to you all of these texts. The Anatomy of a Massacre, 4 Hours in My Lai, is Talking Heads. It's available on YouTube, and it's stories of the soldiers who actually participated in the My Lai massacre. It's an incredible piece of footage. The Invisible War describes sexism in the US military. It's an Oscar-nominated documentary, well worth a watch. Black Hearts by Jim Fedrick, same guy that wrote Black Hawk Down. He describes one platoon's descent into madness in the Iraqi Triangle of Death, and ultimately how 3 of those soldiers went and raped and murdered an Iraqi woman and then murdered her family. The Lucifer Effect is Professor Zimbardo's write-up of the Stanford prison experiment. Interestingly, he didn't write that until the early 2000s, despite the fact the experiment took place in 1975. He felt that he'd been too corrupted by the experiment to write impartially about it. Taxi to the Dark Side is another movie. It describes how an Afghan taxi driver was lifted by special forces, got himself into the high-value custody chain, and ultimately was beaten to death. The Somalia affair that I referenced earlier when I spoke about the Canadian peacekeepers in Somalia. There's a book there, Dark Threats and White Knights, that talks a lot about the hypermasculine culture of that regiment and how that regiment became utterly toxic in its behaviour. Ordinary Men is a book about the Holocaust. It describes Reserve Police Battalion 101, before the death camps were built, how a German territorial army police battalion in many ways followed up behind the Wehrmacht and shot and killed large numbers of Jewish people in Poland. A quite horrendous story, but an insight into group behaviour and how everyone accepted what they were doing was abhorrent and wrong, but felt they had to do it because they were part of this group and that had been their task, and if they didn't do it, someone else would have to do it. And finally, a very British killing, the death of Baha Musa, which I think should be required reading for any British officer to understand how things can and do go wrong. Okay, thanks very much for your attention.